Hello class, my name is Latisha Summers and I will be doing a presentation on a Jim Crow state of mind, the racialization of space in the McKinney, Texas pool party incident. So you may be asking, or you actually may already know about Jim Crow. So I'll give just a brief history of what it was. Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. So, Jumpin' Jim Crow, the song you just heard, the whole concept was actually created by Thomas Rice. Um, the intentions of it was for white people to mock black people in different plays, shows, movies, and using blackface. So, and the concept of that was, whites were superior and that blacks were inferior. And so, somewhere in the state and local laws, they adopted these concepts, and Jim Crow laws were created to enforce segregation in southern states and throughout the United States at the state and local government levels. And that involved things like literacy tests, poll tax qualifications, even to vote. So, but even with white people who weren't allowed or couldn't pass those qualifications, actually created like a loophole or a clause for them, saying basically if their grandfather or their ancestor was allowed to vote, then they could vote too. And it included like segregation in the workplace, schools, entertainment venues, bathrooms, and transportation. The McKinney, Texas pool incident. So the author of this journal, Barbara Harris Combs, examines the Jim Crow mentality where people belong, for about where people belong persists in today's society. So in 2005, in McKinney, Texas, at a pool party, she used this basically as a case study to demonstrate how the gender and social status of children operated to imperial black and brown bodies in the social environment of a predominantly white upper middle class suburban neighborhood. This incident illustrates basically how a Jim Crow mentality, whites are inferior, blacks are, or whites were superior, blacks were inferior, about what type of bodies were allowed to basically navigate or move freely in certain spaces, still undergirds a society, which is an example of bodies out of place. So I've included images of the series on Amazon Prime. It's actually called Them. If you have seen this movie, then you will understand, the concept of bodies out of place. Here it is, you have this predominantly white neighborhood. I believe it's somewhere up north. I've seen it, but I don't remember exactly, but I believe it was up north, where they have this predominantly white neighborhood. And then the first black family, this wife and her two daughters and husband, move into this neighborhood, and they're treated terribly, and treated as if they don't belong there. And if you haven't seen it, then it's on Amazon Prime. So spaces are, considered gendered, race, class, and sites of power. Surveillance of an area, and the people produce two different types of bodies. One, normal, which is, in this case considered, the white families are considered normal. They're freely to, you know, move about and transverse into spaces as freely as they want. The other abnormal, black and brown bodies are marked as not able to go wherever they please, but
even if they went somewhere, it's actually heightened surveillance. Like we're watching you because you don't belong here. And it's a quote in the journal. It says some bodies are deemed as having the right to belong, while others are marked as basically trespassers and labeled as being out of place. The white institutional space logic believes that white people are inclined to act and think as if all the spaces, whether it's geographical, uh, linguistic, economical, spiritual, wherever they go, they should be able to move around freely, in and out as they please. Nobody's questioning you, nobody's looking at you funny, nobody's, treating you as if you don't belong because the concept is basically I walk around how I please because this is where I belong. So um, on the opposite spectrum, people of color basically have to navigate these spaces with care. So you can't look a certain type of way, you can't talk a certain type of way, you can't behave a certain type of way. Even when you do, or even when you don't, look a certain way, talk a certain way, even if you quote unquote behave or don't do anything, you're still out of place. But even in the slightest offenses, you're talking loud, you're dressing funny, you're acting different. Those things can be met with challenge. So if someone challenging you, why do you feel the need that you need to do this certain type of way, and it can result in dangerous consequences. So bodies out of place are essentially stating you don't belong here, which can result in the end moment. A prime example of this would be Trayvon Martin. He was walking in the neighborhood, heading home, I believe it was, and he's followed by George Zimmerman, and he basically repeatedly asked, like, "Why are you following me?" And the concept of that was he didn't belong in that neighborhood. White pools. So in the late 19th and early 20th century, thousands of reciprocal pools were built across the United States, but the pools weren't built in black communities. Two principles to maintain segregation within the pools was to segregate by law, basically preventing blacks from even entering the pools, or segregation through violence. Like they went to the pools, but they were challenged, by white people and beat for swimming. And so, but police would just look the other way. White pools, well, excuse me, pools in general are just considered an intimate space, like it's in close proximity. You share the same space. But not only does it afford for people to come into actual physical contact with one another, it provides a platform for voyeurism. Restrictions, though, on race intermingling in the pool could always be justified by continuing racist ideas that somehow blacks were dirtier than whites, or they're prone to getting diseases that might be passed in the pool, like passed like, oh, I drink the water, or what I'm saying, like the contaminants on your skin have somehow contaminated the pool. um, but racial fears, especially the fear of miscegenation, were at the root of much of this continued practice of segregation. So here's an example of um, a pool incident. I believe it was in Pasadena, where this gentleman had basically asked a black family had they bathed or had they showered before they even went to the pool, going back to the concept of, blacks were dirtier than whites or they carry diseases. And in this case, he actually um, pretends to be like a health inspector, which obviously was found out to there was false information that he indeed was not a health inspector, but he basically was, you know, harassing this family, asking them had they showered. So basically, we're going to go over some of the frameworks of this journal reference to include 8 tenets of bodies at a place. So the first one, racism is systematic and deeply ingrained in our society. People believe that racism are or examples of racism are just isolated incidents. Um, White falsely equate physical integration with social integration, meaning we can share the same space physically, but socially, I'm not on the same, or, black people aren't on the same level as white people. Um, Whites have a possessive investment in colorblind frames. And this is used to maintain social order, like we're on the top. And where that's where whiteness, and we'll discuss that later on, comes into play. Meaning whites, we are morally superior and right. Four, there's a macro micro connection to racism, and it sustains on a micro level but operates on a macro level. These types of levels are used to maintain white dominance, like we are in charge. Um, 5, bodies are out of place in relation to other bodies. Examples of that would be, you know, hypersurveillance, suspicion and bias and within, one community, while other bodies are presumed to belong there. Um, Perceive out of place bodies invoke a response. These things basically help to restore social order or the perceived notion of displacement of others that don't belong. Colorblind logics justify the response. These typical things can include things like what they call as new language, um, that's that often includes offensive wording or offensive actions. Um, Intersectional bodies produce intersectional responses. Basically, every consequence of being who you are results into what happens to you. And here we're going to play the actual McKinney, Texas pool incident. I believe it was a kid named Brandon that actually recorded this incident, and this is how it went viral and made the news. So in the McKinney Pool incident, some of the examples of things that happened within this, Officer Casebolt was quoted, to say, telling the teens, well, keep running your mouth and see what happens. And, we see that, that basically, we can't force racial segregation, but we can use other logics like intimidation, the abuse of police authority to enforce, rules on people. Um, he was called the Patrolman of the Year, and he felt like it was his response or his duty to respond to the call. So basically, because he was, a police officer, they humanized him, and justified his actions through this incident. And he was also viewed as a victim. He deserved sympathy because, he was just doing his job. Megan Kelly from Fox News quoted, the girl was no saint either. He had told her to leave and she lingered. When the cops tell you to leave, then get out. So racism is thought to believe by white people that it's just an isolated incident. It's only happens for a few bad people. And the Texas radio host called the teens jungle animals. White racial frame is founded upon pro-white attitudes and beliefs, meaning the white is superior and blacks are inferior. McKinney just couldn't be a bad place to live because in 2014, the Money magazine had named it the best small place to live, which in 2019, they had a lawsuit basically claiming discrimination, and segregation within the housing market. So, McKinney, some more on the McKinney, Texas point incident. Brandon Brooks, the young white teen who recorded this was described as a local teen and a bystander. He actually insinuated that basically he was invisible by the police while his black friends weren't, compared to the young girl in the video who was a product of hyper surveillance. Grace Stone, a white person, was actually detained after she pled with police to just leave them alone. So her guilt or her crime was basically, interfering with these black teens and, being on the side with them. And, society basically states that white women are frail, they're delicate, so they need protection from black people, especially black men who are stereotyped as aggressors. And the race test is an example of black and brown people because they don't pose a threat to white people, which promotes the fiction that the space is open. Basically, because you're not a threat, then we welcome you physically, but again, we don't welcome you socially. Whiteness as property. Whiteness means being able to access the benefits of property ownership in the way that non-white property owners can't. Meaning we're allowed to have these benefits, but you guys are not. So examples in this McKinney, Texas incident, I had already went over number two, white falsely equate physical integration with social integration. Yeah, again, Money Magazine said, everybody come, it's the best place to live. We welcome you physically, but again, we don't welcome you socially. Number eight, intersectional bodies produce intersectional responses. Casebolt was basically straddling over this young teen, given the perception that, black woman's body is a white person or a white man's property. And, black woman's body, even a black man's body, they don't have any rights, and the white man is to be respected. Number five, bodies are out of place in relation to other bodies. Basically, the teens were perceived to be in the wrong neighborhood. And so, which goes into number six, perceived out of place bodies and vocal response, which results in the aggressors, the people um, that basically adding more fuel to the fire, these police officers, putting them back into place, putting back them back into their place. Number seven, colorblind logics justify the response. And again, using that new language when the teens were described as trespassers, fence jumpers, mob, actually used by a police officer Casebolt, jungle animals, like the radio host had called them. Um, Even not necessarily calling, but the white woman who told the black people to go back to their Section 8 homes. So in conclusion, McKinney Texas, the pool incident was just one example of what it's like to live in a modern Jim Crow era. Basically, given the thought that blacks are inferior to whites, that are superior, like they're higher than. That we welcome you in some neighborhoods, but we're always watching you as a hyper surveillance. And using that new language, labeling, which also goes into my third point, the Karens, um, conflicts, the Karens, I mean, using their notion of, you know, what makes you think that you can do this? What makes you think you can say that? I am right. I am justified. I am higher than. I'm more superior than you are. Um, and we see, instances in the justice system that's been under scrutiny for the potential injustices within the law, the police killings of innocent black men and women, which is also founded, by the foundation of or the formation of Black Lives Matter organization, and we see things even to this day as far as the last election, with the issues of potential voter suppression in Georgia. So I really hope that you guys enjoyed my presentation. I hope that you learned about this incident. If you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. Thank you.